The last day of August 1994 was a hopeful and historic day in Northern Ireland. The country's main paramilitary group, the Irish Republican Army, announced a ceasefire in its long and bitter fight against supporters of British rule in Northern Ireland. The IRA promised a complete cessation of military activities.
A complete cessation of military operations means that there can be no going back.
Since 1921, Ireland was a house divided. That year, the southern Catholic counties won independence from Britain, while northern Protestant counties remained under British rule. Through the rest of the century, violence between the two sides escalated to the point of civil war. The ceasefire agreement raised hopes that peace was finally at hand. That week in the Irish Times newspaper, a poem appeared entitled Ceasefire.
A poem appearing in the Irish Times, as this poem did, is read by a huge percentage of the population. It struck a chord in many people's hearts.
Ceasefire was set at the close of an ancient conflict, the Trojan War, and ended with a haunting refrain. I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son.
It's a poem about how bitter the aftermath of war is, and how peace is another name for war. And certainly nobody heals miraculously after that.
The poem was an instant classic and was frequently quoted as Ireland struggled to find a path towards peace. Poetry is powerful in Ireland. This harsh land, besieged by violence, poverty, and strife, has produced some of the world's most enduring lyric poets.
Poetry certainly is more a part of everyday life here. Whether you're in a middle-class drawing room in Ballsbridge or at the back end of a pub after a party late at night, the common culture is for people to do something, and quite often they sing. And quite often they will recite poems.
The Irish people have no fear of the poet. They don't fear that the poet is some exempt invention of educated or elite classes.
To read the poets of Ireland gives a sense of the core of that society.
The sense of what your calling means as a poet has always been strong in Ireland.
It's important to read Irish poetry just because it's delightful, because it's rich in the mouth, like biting into a good apple.
Since ancient times, Ireland's poets have wielded great power. Poets, or bards, were members of the nobility.
The bard, of course, was a significant figure in society. Every chieftain had his bard who accompanied him.
So powerful was the word of the bards, it was believed their satirical verses could bring disease, destruction, even death.
They work like this. You were the patron, and you hated your neighbor, and I was the local poet. And you came to me and you said, if you can write something venomous enough, then I'll pay you. And so you were, poet with a motive.
They were also historians and people who knew the laws, medicine, where the borders of land were. They were the portable libraries and arbiters of culture before writing.
The bards composed poetry in their heads, in a darkened room or cell, memorizing as they went. And their poems were created in Ireland's native language, Gaelic. But more than 8 centuries of domination by the British, who were mostly Protestant, nearly overwhelmed Irish cultural identity, which was primarily Catholic. Catholics were not allowed to buy land, or vote, or hold public office. The British tried to impose their own religion and culture on the Irish, but they couldn't wipe out the folk tales and poems that had been sung through the centuries.
What stayed with the Irish were the portable arts, the fugitive arts, the arts that stay with the people in the dark times. And those are things you can recite, stories you can tell, poems you can remember, something a mother can tell her daughter. So if you take the idea of arts that belong to a people in a dark time, then you get a very, very potent view of what art means and what poetry means.
One Saturday night, he came down to town.
Though they kept their voice alive, Ireland's poets had to do it with what was to them a foreign language, English.
We took the language that humiliated us and we told our story in it. That's the real truth of Irish literature, and that's why it is a great literature, because we took that language and we made it tell our story.
Through poetry, Yvonne Boland told her own story about struggling with language.
The Irish don't say I'm not, they say I amn't. It's a holdover phrase. The bickering of vowels on the buses, the clicking thumbs and the big hips of the navy-skirted ticket collectors with their crooked seams brought it home to me. Exile. Barely gelled a freckled 6-year-old, overdressed and sick on the plane, when all of England to an Irish child was nothing more than what you'd lost and how, was the teacher in the London convent who, when I produced I amn't in the classroom, turned and said, "You're not in Ireland now." When I was a child in London, Ireland might have been 20,000 miles away. It was a country you'd lost by changing countries. So the first knowledge of your identity through not being and not belonging in a place was very important to me.
Up until the early 20th century, contemporary Irish literature barely existed in the world's imagination. Everyone looked to England for great literature. But one man changed all that. William Butler Yeats set out to revive Irish literature. His poetry and plays drew upon Celtic mythology and unleashed a distinctive Irish voice. Yeats was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1922, the first Irishman to win that mark of distinction.
One of the things Yeats did was he showed that Irish poetry need not be in any sense deferential to British poetry. He wrote a different poem, a different lyric poem in the Irish tradition.
Yeats carved out a place for Irish poetry in world literature, but he was also part of the Protestant upper class and wrote about an idealized Ireland, as if from a distance.
Yeats's position was always that of the man on a horse looking down on the peasantry.
Yeats's view of Ireland was almost unknown to most of the Irish, who were still living in poverty under British rule.
When Yeats spoke, things became weighty and significant, and he almost was unable to just sit down, have a beer, and say something in a kind of down-to-earth way.
Irish poetry had to be liberated twice. First of all from British poetry and then from Yeats.
The man most credited with liberating Irish poetry from the legacy of William Butler Yeats was the least likely character to take up the mantle of Ireland's next great poet. His name was Patrick Kavanagh.
If you're putting up a statue of Yeats, you would have to pose him in a slightly heroic, eloquent, prophetic pose. If you're putting up a statue of Kavanagh, and indeed a statue of Kavanagh has been put up, a sculpture of him, he's much more the man slumped on a seat, looking at the waters of the canal, a relaxed countryman in the town with his hat and his slump.
Patrick Kavanagh came from the farmsteads of County Monaghan. He was poor and had little education. Unlike Yeats's romanticized view of the countryside, Kavanagh's poetry told about the harshness and drudgery of farm life, and at the same time, elevated it to the stuff of great poetry.
Kavanagh has a sense of what a field looks like that you can only have if you've actually plowed it. And Yeats had never been behind a plow.
One of Kavanagh's greatest poems is about two Irish farmers fighting over the boundary line between their land at the outset of World War II.
It's set during what he calls the Munich bother, just before the Second World War, just after the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Hitler, the appeasement at Munich. And Kavanagh at this time is in County Monaghan. The big war is getting ready. He's witnessing a fight between two farmers. Which is more important, he asks.
I've lived in important places, times when great events were decided. Who owned that half a rood of rock and no man's land, surrounded by our pitchfork-armed claims? That was the year of the Munich bother. Which was more important? I inclined to lose my faith in Ballyrush and Gortin, till Homer's ghost came whispering to my mind. He said, I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance.
He was making a distinction between the parochial and the provincial, which is a very important distinction in art. It doesn't look like it, but it is important. And he said that the parochial person was the person who believed they lived at the center of the earth. Nothing mattered but the parish. The provincial was always looking over their shoulder to see were they doing it more importantly in London or Los Angeles or somewhere. And, you know, the best of Irish writing at that time was parochial.
Kavanagh freed a new generation of poets, poets who found their inspiration in the Ireland that was emerging in their midst. One of those poets was Seamus Heaney. Like Yeats, Heaney is a Nobel laureate. Like Kavanagh, Heaney looked to the rural farms and fields of his childhood for inspiration.
When I was a youngster going to school, the old people along the road, this was a common saying, wise saying of the elder, who said, you know, the pen is a lot lighter than the spade, young fellow. You know, stick to the books. So this poem of mine called Digging is basically an expanded version of that truth. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father, digging. I look down, till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills, where he was digging. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
He has continued to dig. I mean, one of the extraordinary, remarkable aspects of Seamus Heaney has been his ability, an ability that he shares with Yeats indeed, to himself remake. Myself I must remake is Yeats's great line. And it's the mark of a great poet that somehow, he or she can reinvent themselves. His position in the country is actually quite remarkable. He's a huge public figure, much more of a public figure, I think, than Yeats ever was.
Like many of his generation, Heaney left the farm of his childhood and moved to the city, where dramatic changes were taking place. In the 1960s, Ireland was transforming from an impoverished country of small-scale farmers to a prosperous, industrialized nation. But political tensions were also on the rise, especially in the north. And Ireland's poets were there both as witnesses and agents of change.
My own generation of poets and writers found themselves called upon to say something about what was happening to everybody in the north.
In 1969, the Catholic minority of Northern Ireland, inspired by the civil rights movement in the U.S., began pressuring the ruling Protestant majority for equal rights. What began as nonviolent protests quickly led to increasingly deadly confrontations between Catholics and Protestants.
It was a pretty horrifying time. That was not, mind you, without its own strange courtliness, its own strange mannerliness, in that these tit-for-tat murders where one night a Protestant would be shot, the next night a Catholic, there was an extraordinary order to it, a terrifying order to it.
Even poets who did not consider themselves political felt compelled to speak out. Paul Muldoon and other poets of his generation were deeply affected by Ireland's political troubles.
One could not possibly have lived there through all of that without having, in some sense, tried to understand it, tried to come to terms with one's own bewilderment.
Through poetry, Muldoon explored the tension of living in a divided country.
You remember that village where the border ran down the middle of the street, with the butcher and baker in different states. Today, he remarked how a shower of rain had stopped so cleanly across Golightly's Lane. It might have been a wall of glass that had toppled over. He stood there for ages to wonder which side, if any, he should be on.
By the 1970s, a divided Ireland seemed stuck in an endless cycle of violence. People questioned whether peace was even possible. Seamus Heaney found inspiration for a poetic response to violence in an unlikely place. An archaeological site containing bodies dating back to the Iron Age 2,000 years ago that had been preserved in a bog.
The thing about poetry is quite often you don't choose the subject chooses you.
One bog body was of a 14-year-old girl who was beaten and punished, possibly because of sexual infidelity.
So this body was found in a bog with sticks over it. And this connected in my mind with things that were going on at present in the city of Derry and Belfast. Young women who were not beaten but tarred and feathered because they had been associating with British troops.
In one case of a so-called punishment beating, a young girl was tied to a lamppost, had her hair cut off, and blue paint poured on her.
They were regarded as betraying their people. I can see her drowned body in the bog, the weighing stone, the floating rods and boughs, her shaved head like a stubble of black corn, her blindfold a soiled bandage, her noose a ring to store the memories of love. Little adulteress, before they punished you, you were flaxen-haired, undernourished, and your tar-black face was beautiful. My poor scapegoat, I almost love you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I who have stood dumb when your betraying sisters, called in tar, wept by the railings, who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal, intimate revenge.
He would connive, as to say, would wink in civilized outrage and say it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible, but on the other hand, understand the society in which such punishment, towerings and featherings, beatings might emerge. That's not to say that he condones it, just that he understands it.
Political violence was not the only pressure point Irish poets felt obliged to address. The dominance of the Catholic Church and its hold on Irish social mores also came into question. In 1984, Ireland was scandalized by the tragic story of Anne Lovett, a young girl living in the small farm town of Graynard, who became pregnant out of wedlock.
She became pregnant in a village where she simply couldn't have told anyone. She was a friendless girl.
At that time in Ireland, girls in Anne Lovett's situation had no options. Under the influence of the Catholic Church, abortion, contraception, and even divorce were all illegal. In 1984, on a freezing January day, Anne Lovett went into labor. She walked out to a hillside shrine near her village and gave birth beneath a statue of the Virgin Mary. Both she and the baby died. One poem told Anne Lovett's story from the statue's point of view.
On a night like this, I remember the child who came with 15 summers to her name, and she lay down alone at my feet, without midwife or doctor or friend to hold her hand, and she pushed her secret out into the night, far from the town, tucked up in little scandals, bargains struck, words broken, prayers, promises. And though she cried out to me in extremis, I did not move. I didn't lift a finger to help her. I didn't intercede with heaven, nor whisper the charmed word in God's ear. On a night like this, I number the days to the solstice and the turn back to the light. O sun, center of our foolish dance, burning heart of stone, molten mother of us all, hear me and have pity.
The poem helped break through the silence that had surrounded taboo subjects in Ireland's socially conservative society.
There were poems like this that seemed to kind of push the discourse through so that it became possible in Ireland to talk about things like birth out of wedlock, abortion, contraception, divorce. Ireland now is a completely different place than it was in the 80s.
Irish society has changed rapidly. In the 1990s, both divorce and contraception became legal, and in some cases, even abortion is allowed. The country elected its first woman president, Mary Robinson, in 1990.
The Ireland I will be representing is a new Ireland.
And in 1998, political parties representing the interests of both Catholics and Protestants in Ireland signed the Good Friday Agreement, a roadmap toward peace and power sharing in the country. Through these tremendous changes, Ireland's poets have used the power of their words to help shape and understand the country's public life, both within and beyond Ireland's borders.
There's a sense of unfinished business about the country. One of the things that poets are attempting to do is to make sense of themselves in their society. That is one of the very first reasons why there's so much poetry coming out of Ireland. There is a general acceptance that we must make sense of who we are, of where we've been, of where we might end up.
Forever in Ireland, there's a strong trust in poetry by a significantly large number of people who believe that poetry is an important part of the culture, part of the inheritance, and who cherish it, and who guard it, and who keep it.
The Irish people don't fear that the poet is some exempt invention of educated or elite classes. They're the person who wrote the invective, they're the person who wrote the wedding poem, they're the person who came to the christening. They are the companion of the life of the people.
As a child, they couldn't keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. Now to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed Narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing.
Oh, the praties, they grow small, and we dig them in the fall, and we eat them skin and all over here, over here. Oh, I wish that